Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, you guys have met the best. Now it's time to meet the rest, as in today's video we are in fact going to be taking a long overdue look at the worst Transformers Studio Series figures of all time. Now before we get started with the video, I would really appreciate it if you guys could all smash that like button, and as always please feel free to let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Now for this list, I've selected 10 of what I personally believe to be the worst Transformers Studio Series figures that we've so far seen since of course the line launched in 2018. For those of you who may remember, I kinda teased this video way back in 2019 when I did my top 5 worst movie figures of all time. However, back then, to be honest, there really wasn't a big enough selection to truly do a justified video. We were really only 1 year into the line and all of them for the most part were pretty decent. However, 4 years on since that first wave, whilst the vast majority of the figures since then have all been really awesome, there have definitely been some that, well, let's be honest and just say have been complete and utter trash. So before we get started with the video, the figures I've selected have been chosen for two main reasons. First of all, accuracy. The Studio Series line, as many of you guys know, sets out to give us the most definitive representation of the Transformers as they appeared in their respected movies. So if a figure, say, doesn't match up or improve upon a previous release or is just straight up inaccurate, it's definitely going to find itself on the list, and the majority of the figures that are on the list all really do suffer from horrendous inaccuracies. The second reason is build quality slash just overall enjoyability. Whilst the majority of modern day figures are made pretty well, there are some sadly in the Studio Series line specifically of which absolutely suck, and I'm pretty certain there are a few that are already jumping into your guys' minds and will no doubt in fact actually be featured on this particular list. So if a figure can't stay in one piece, it's definitely going to find itself here. And so with all that being said, without further ado, let's kickstart this video off and take a look at the first entry into the worst Transformers Studio Series list of all time. So first up we have Lockdown, based on Transformers Age of Extinction. Now this is probably going to be a rather controversial pick, however the figure has found himself on this list for quite a few reasons. First up, the figure fails to majorly improve over his 2014 counterpart. Whilst looking superior where detail is concerned, this release is just way too small, which was something that I massively disliked about the first version. As compared next to Optimus Prime, of whom he truly rivals with in Transformers 4, he just does not stack up at all. It's also fairly clunky in design, lacking in proper distinguishable hands, and still retaining a rather shell-like transformation from its predecessor. This Lockdown looks more like a Ninja Turtle than the badass bounty hunter as he's portrayed on screen, and this is further highlighted when trying to pose this guy, as the articulation is literally something that has been ripped out of the 2010 era of figures, as there is no waist articulation, no wrist articulation, and you can completely forget about ankle rocker pivot that we've all become accustomed to with the most recent Studio Series figures, and of course even the War for Cybertron trilogy. And finally, honestly, one of the biggest missed opportunities here is the lack of the iconic face cannon that Lockdown had in the movie. This is one of his signature weapons and is arguably one of the coolest CG sequences out of the entire Transformers 4 movie, so to see it missing here, I once again think that's a major mistake on Hasbro's part. However, with all that being said, the figure has in fact actually been coated in a super nice gunmetal grey, of which is a lot more accurate to how he appeared in the movie when in comparison to the original 2014 Deluxe, and the Lamborghini Alt mode looks absolutely incredible. And of course with the recent release of the Bumblebee movie figures, we know that Hasbro have to strike a balance between the live action movie figures of which actually transform in the film, as they are in fact actually dealing with licenses, so the Lamborghini has to look like a Lamborghini, and sadly the robot mode does kind of get the short end of the stick and has to have the most compromises made to it. But ultimately there are just way too many negatives here, sadly making this figure one of the worst Studio Series entries that we've seen from the line thus far. Next up, we have the Dark the Moon Studio Series Crankcase. Now, I'm pretty certain that there'll be many of you guys out there who in fact actually expected this to be on the lower end of this list. However, the actual mold itself, I personally think to be one of the coolest Decepticon designs that we've ever seen. Of course, it's essentially just Crowbar. The only reasoning behind why I personally think this figure specifically is one of the worst Studio Series figures so far is because it's just so blatantly inaccurate, and to add even further insult to injury, almost basically a year prior to the release of this this figure, Hasbro had already released the perfect crankcase, that in the form of the Transformers The Last Knight Berserker. So in my personal opinion, it truly just was negligence on their part that this figure made his way into the line. We'll no doubt see a reissue of Berserker in the future, just slightly redecoed to resemble Crankcase. Honestly, I wouldn't mind if it was just basically a straight up re-release with maybe the dreads picked out in a metallic gold, as that really would be just the perfect Crankcase figure. But honestly, this is really lacking to me. I just think that it is a waste of a release, and if anything, Hasbro should have maybe just slightly retooled this and turned it into a Dark the Moon hatchet. We then have Transformers Revenge of the Fallen Satellite Soundwave. Now, I know there are many of you guys out there who in fact actually really love the way this figure looks. However, from the offset, I've never been a huge fan of this mold. When I did my initial review way back in 2020, I absolutely bashed this, as I think it's one of the few Studio Series releases of which is in fact a downgrade when in comparison to its predecessor. The 2009 Satellite Soundwave, I personally think absolutely hands down obliterates this version. Just in the satellite mode alone, it looks so much more accurate. The color scheme is so much more impressive. All of the satellite almost panels that we've got going on for the armor looks awesome, and the actual robot mode that the original 2009 Deluxe figure has, to me, looks incredible, whereas this figure is just a mess. The color scheme is just so bland. It's got this really weird, almost black specular paint application applied over it. It looks super random, and to be honest, actually quite bad. I think the robot mode is appalling. It looks incredibly generic, honestly has nothing on its original predecessor. And to add further insult to injury, Hasbro didn't even incorporate a ejecting Ravage, much like we saw with that 2009 Deluxe release. So personally for me, I have no doubt in stating that not only is this one of the worst Studio Series figures out there, but it is by far one of the major downgrades that the line has so far seen. And it's quite surprising considering that the vast majority of the figures from this wave and from this line in general have all been majorly improved when in comparison to their original offerings. We then turn our attention to a relatively new figure that in the form of the Transformers Bumblebee Deluxe class Cliffjumper. Now, to be honest, had we not seen some of the awesome Bumblebee movie waves that we've seen in the last 6 months, I probably wouldn't have put this figure on the list, but just in comparison, this looks like it's from a completely different era of Transformers. Some of the newer figures have managed the back kibble so much nicer and still have retained incredible accuracy where the robot mode is concerned, and just as awesome Cybertronian vehicle modes, whereas this figure sadly really only has a cool vehicle mode. I think that in regards to the robot mode, there is just way too much backpack. Much like Lockdown, this guy really does resemble a red Ninja Turtle. Then of course the sleek and elegant design that we saw from Cliffjumper very briefly in the Bumblebee movie. This guy also has the inaccurate weapon. He never used the Stinger Blaster in the film. It was more of a hand cannon, so once again completely inaccurate, and the tolerances on this figure literally was something that was so damn dire. None of the panels on the legs held together, the ball joints in the thighs were incredibly loose, and not to mention that the entire backpack was made out of clear plastic, and two tabs of which do in fact actually form the front of the vehicle became brittle super quickly, which for a modern Deluxe release, personally I just think is really unacceptable. This is one of the few Bumblebee movie figures of which I do in fact actually think is in a major need of an update, and that's quite surprising considering that from the offset we should in fact actually already see the definitive version of this character. Now, my next pick for one of the worst Studio Series figures of all time, to be honest, was one that I was actually quite hesitant to include. On one hand, I actually think that as a standalone figure it's pretty decent, but for the Studio Series, I think that scrap metal here definitely is rather uninspired where the design is concerned. It just doesn't match the almost alien insectoid design that the majority of the Constructicons had, and to be honest really does stick out like a sore thumb when in comparison to the other 7 Constructicons that of course form Devastator. I think the robot mode looks more like it's been inspired by the G1 series than the Bayverse, and just overall I definitely think there was a much cooler design in the concept art of Buckethead than the actual figure that we ended up getting here for the Hasbro Devastator. With all that being said, the plastic's really well made, the actual robot mode doesn't look bad, and it is an enjoyable figure, but in terms of a design, I just think that it is so bland and so lacking. Transformation's pretty neat, I think the constructional mode's cool, and of course for those of you who are a fan of the Bayverse Devastator, then you had to pick this guy up in order to complete him, but he is in fact one of the rarest Constructicons out there, and to be honest, it really does baffle me as to why, as at least in my personal opinion, he's by far one of the worst looking Decepticons that we've seen from the Studio Series so far. Now we're at the midway point of this list, and this is really where you guys are going to see me bashing the crap out of some of these figures, and it has got to start off with Stinger. This is just utter trash and garbage. This was one of the first Studio Series figures that were released for Wave 1, and to be honest with you, it left an incredibly bad taste in my mouth. We had wanted an updated, more accurate version of Stinger ever since the 2014 movie, and in 2018, when they actually got round to giving him his own distinguished mold, I couldn't have been more let down than I was. The robot mode lacked incredibly. The torso, I have no idea whatsoever what was going on with that chest. It looked terrible. It was incredibly gappy, really hollow. The figure from a side profile was really spindly. It literally looked nothing like how Stinger appeared on screen, much like Lockdown. It didn't have distinguished hands. They were just basically panels from the side of the car. I thought the shuriken attachment on the back looked really out of place, and the actual blaster that they gave him looked like an absolute pile of crap. It literally looked like the roof of the vehicle crunched up and slapped onto the arm. It resembled nothing like we saw in the movie. The only redeeming factor about this figure would be the fact that it did in fact actually transform into a pretty decent Pagani, but other than that, the build quality I also thought was trash. The joints became loose incredibly quickly. I had many joints of which very easily became stressed, and to be honest, this is just not an example of what we should be expecting from a modern day Transformers figure. I'd even go as far as saying that the Takara Tomy movie Advanced Stinger that we got way back in 2014, which was basically just a straight up repaint of Age of Extinction Bumblebee, is a better figure overall when in comparison to what should be the more accurate version here with our Studio Series offering. We then turn to a more recent movie Decepticon, that in the form of the helicopter Dropkick. Now, to be honest, on one hand, I can kind of forgive Hasbro, as 9 times out of 10, concepts for the movie always tend to change, and this was sadly definitely a prime example of that. This version of Dropkick resembled nothing of what we saw in the movie, specifically in regards to the robot mode. Not only was the colour palette completely off, but just the design in itself looked nothing like Dropkick at all. Starting off firstly with the arms, they just look like an absolute train wreck. They were super spindly. They had this massive kibble hanging off the forearm, and it was an asymmetrical design as well, which once again looked terrible. We had one propeller on one arm and then basically just a flap on the other. The hands looked dreadful. The actual skinniness of the legs was just so bad. The head sculpt wasn't too bad looking, but once again to me was way too small, and the transformation surprisingly was fairly involved, which resulted in by far one of the best helicopter modes that I personally think we've ever seen Hasbro and Takara put out. But in regards to an actual deluxe offering in itself, this is by far one of the worst Studio Series figures I think we've ever seen. As far as accuracy is concerned, it should have just been tossed straight out the window as soon as this figure was put into mass production, as this literally does not resemble not even a concept art that I personally can find online of how Dropkick was supposed to appear in the movie. The only saving grace of this, as mentioned, was the helicopter mode, and was that they did borrow the engineering to make the helicopter drift, of which is a vastly superior looking figure. Now we're down to the final 3 turds. Starting off, we're going to be taking a look at the World War II Bumblebee. This figure is just utter garbage. Much like Dropkick, this is just so inaccurate to how Bumblebee actually appeared in that World War II sequence. The colour scheme straight away he's not even green in the movie. He's supposed to be an almost darker grey. This here is just so bad looking. He actually looks like a Ninja Turtle. He's got this massive backpack which holds the majority of the vehicle mode. Honestly, the transformation is one of the most uninspired conversions that I've ever seen collecting Bayverse figures. It's so simplistic. Literally, it is a shell former, the definition of a shell former. The articulation is really lacking, considering that basically everything is obstructed by a different kibble. In regards to the actual vehicle mode, completely inaccurate to the vehicle mode that Bumblebee sports in that flashback sequence. Now, you could argue that maybe they couldn't get the license to the vehicle used in the film, but this doesn't even try and resemble that. They turn him into an almost concept artillery tank looking thing. It just looks absolute trash. The figure was very loose out of the packaging first time round, and they even reused this mold for the World War II Hot Rod, a figure of which also is utter trash. So this definitely is by far one of the worst Bumblebee figures I think we've ever seen, not only from the Studio Series line, but from the entire Transformers movie lines in general. This is by far one of the worst Bumblebees ever, and as far as Studio Series are concerned, it's a figure that I will never ever feature highly on my list again. And second to last of being one of the worst Studio Series figures of all time has to go to a character of which surprisingly actually lives up to her name, that in the form of Transformers Shatter, inspired by the Bumblebee movie. This figure is just utter garbage. You guys pay £22 to £24, at least here in the UK, and you get a figure of which not only is super inaccurate to how she appeared in the movie, but the actual build quality is just garbage. You would get better build quality from a dollar or a pound store item. Literally, you cannot transform this figure without a piece falling off. The arms on the ball joints continuously want to pop off. They're super loose. The panels of which actually form the side of the vehicle or the side front of the vehicle, basically they're not even worth being there, as when you just hinge them upwards, they pop clean off. The whole backpack is just way too big, completely made out of transparent plastic. I don't know about yourselves, but I had many areas of which were very easily to stress. The only redeeming aspect about this release were that some of the details in the bot mode weren't bad, and the actual vehicle mode was very accurate to how she appeared in the film. So this is one of the few SS figures that I do still keep in the collection, but however in her vehicle form. I don't tend to ever display them in alt mode, but this really is a figure of which I think is only good looking when in vehicle mode. I just have no idea how this figure was allowed to slip through Hasbro's fingers. The head sculpt looks like nothing we saw in the movie. I know there will be some out there that say she kind of looked like this for a very brief flashback sequence on Cybertron, but it's like a 0.5 second appearance, and that can't warrant an entire figure being this inaccurate in my personal opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comment section below, but to me this is definitely by far one of the most frustrating deluxe class movie figures that I personally have ever picked up in my entire time collecting Transformers toys. And taking the number one spot of being the biggest pile of all time, it has got to be the Transformers Bumblebee Volkswagen Deluxe class Bumblebee. Oh my goodness, honestly, I could write you guys an essay of all of the things of which are wrong with this figure. Straight off the bat, much like the helicopter dropkick and the car Shatter, incredibly inaccurate to the film. It has these awful, huge door wings of which look like nothing that we ever saw in the movie. I know he kind of partially transformed in Charlie's house and he kind of had the door wings, but nowhere near long enough to in fact actually warrant getting the main deluxe figure to have them permanently attached. They just look absolutely atrocious. The kibble is terrible, the figure is very top heavy, the ball joints in the legs cannot withstand the weight, at least on my personal copy. In regards to the actual scale of the figure, it's by far one of the smallest deluxe figures I think Hasbro had ever put together. It's so small. It comes with very inaccurate weapons. The Stinger cannon looks like nothing we ever saw in the movie. The transformation is so damn fiddly, honestly. I don't think I've ever been this frustrated by a deluxe figure since ever. Literally, to transform this into the VW Bug was an absolute nightmare, and whilst the alt mode does look pretty decent once you manage to in fact actually get everything tabbed together, the transformation from point A to point B is just a nightmare. It took me almost 20 minutes to get everything almost correctly tabbed in, but considering the scale and the fact that the engineering just isn't all that great, it makes this one of the most unenjoyable Bumblebee figures I think that we have ever seen, making it more than worthy of taking the worst spot, the number one spot of being the worst Transformers Studio Series figure of all time. And so there you guys have it. That was my top 10 worst Transformers Studio Series list of all time. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Of course, it's been a long time coming. I teased this originally back in 2019. However, have just been postponing it until we've seen a more wider range of bad Transformers figures. And to be honest, I think almost each and every one of them that I've packed onto this list are more than worthy. Lockdown, as mentioned previously, I personally don't find to be nowhere near of an upgrade when in comparison to the original version. The Crankcase is just an insult to Bayverse fans. It is not Crankcase, it is Crowbar. The Satellite Soundwave, once again, definitely not an improvement over its original counterpart. Cliff Jumper, really loose tolerances. The transformation just does not work, as those panels on the legs, no matter how tightly you try and peg them in, just will not stay. And not to mention that he's got basically a small city slap bang on his back. Scrap Metal, not a bad figure, but definitely not a good looking figure. I think the design is really poor. Stinger, I hate it. I really don't like it. It's made very cheaply. The transformation is a nightmare. The actual look of the robot mode is appalling. The only good thing about it is the vehicle mode. Same can also be said for Dropkick. Looks terrible in robot mode, decent in helicopter mode. World War II Bumblebee looks good in none of the modes. Trash in robot mode and absolute trash in vehicle mode. And the same can also be said for the Shatter, although her Plymouth alt mode actually doesn't look too bad. But build quality is a massive issue on that figure. Literally, you should not be able to pick up a Hasbro product and be subjected to such poor quality control as you are here for Shatter. and the Volkswagen Bumblebee honestly is just an absolute train wreck. I recently revisited the mold when I took a look at the premium finish version, and honestly it just made me so damn frustrated. So I'm hoping that we never see that figure reissued or re-released again in the future, as I'm so done ever taking a look at that guy over on the channel. I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comment section below. Do you guys think that I've been particularly too harsh on any of the releases? Do you think my list is justified? Are there any figures of which you guys personally think that I've missed and would have liked to have seen on the list? And also be sure to let me know what your top 10 worst list would look like down in the comment section below. I thank you all so much for watching, and until my next video, I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.